The formal responses to Campbell and Ratner's article reveal traces of the same blind spots. Thus, the former U.S. ambassador to China, J. Stapleton Roy, makes a rigid distinction between the use of values in justifying American policies and the hard-headed national interests that formulate them, dismissing entirely what he refers to as gauzy dreams of democracy in U.S. rhetoric towards China and the false premise that U.S. policy was intended to remake China in the United States image. Roy nevertheless is not immune to the impulse of American exceptionalism and its capacity to shape the kind of China Washington wants. Echoing Robert Zoellick's desire for Beijing to act as a responsible stakeholder in the international system, Roy contends that a responsibly behaved Washington can still balance China's growing strength and foster its peaceful rise. Having denounced the idealism of previous policymakers, he nevertheless reveals a certain susceptibility to the very same motives. Washington, he writes, needs to recapture its global leadership role by emphasizing that U.S. policies seek the common good, not simply the good of the United States. Woodrow Wilson could hardly have put it any better. Thomas Christensen and Patricia Kim are even more effusive in proposing the United States should continue encouraging Chinese leaders to seek political stability and greater prosperity through more liberty and freer markets. The United States can do this in two ways: by getting its own house in order to set an example that inspires Chinese citizens and elites, and by continuing to try to persuade Chinese leaders at all levels that political and economic reform will produce more stability and wealth than will doubling down on statist economics and authoritarianism, like Roy and indeed Campbell and Ratner. The assumption here is that if America had a president committed to the ethic of American globalism, the state of play in the U.S.-China relationship would be much more to America's advantage. Such a view also taps into the same kinds of exceptionalist myths about the United States as the model for China, the guiding hand overseeing a teleological progression towards greater democratic liberalization and reform. In short, Christensen and Kim envisage a China that is remade in the American image, harking back to precisely the kind of approach that dominated U.S. thinking on China from the 1970s. Nevertheless, they do highlight the real dilemma faced by the Chinese leadership, namely how to maintain its tight authoritarian grip at the same time as allowing the market to more freely allocate resources. Thomas Christensen and Patricia Kim are even more effusive in proposing the United States should continue encouraging Chinese leaders to seek political stability and greater prosperity through more liberty and freer markets. The United States can do this in two ways: by getting its own house in order to set an example that inspires Chinese citizens and elites, and by continuing to try to persuade Chinese leaders at all levels that political and economic reform will produce more stability and wealth than will doubling down on statist economics and authoritarianism, like Roy and indeed Campbell and Ratner. The assumption here is that if America had a president committed to the ethic of American globalism, the state of play in the U.S.-China relationship would be much more to America's advantage. Such a view also taps into the same kinds of exceptionalist myths about the United States as the model for China, the guiding hand overseeing a teleological progression towards greater democratic liberalization and reform. In short, Christensen and Kim envisage a China that is remade in the American image, harking back to precisely the kind of approach that dominated U.S. thinking on China from the 1970s. Nevertheless, they do highlight the real dilemma faced by the Chinese leadership, namely how to maintain its tight authoritarian grip at the same time as allowing the market to more freely allocate resources. Though they do not define it in these terms, what Campbell and Ratner in effect are tilting against is a long-standing American nationalist view of how China ought ultimately to behave. This has deep roots in the history of the U.S.-China relationship, dating at least back to the late 19th century when growing numbers of Americans first encountered China. These Americans, as historian Michael Hunt showed some time ago, might have reinforced earlier stereotypes of the Chinese as weak, vulnerable and backward, but they also at the same time envisaged what China might become under the patronage of American diplomacy and the invigorating influence of American finance, trade and mission work. That particular image of China appealed powerfully to their countrymen, ever on the lookout for an arena to exercise their greatness and conditioned to expect the westward flow of civilization. The open-door policy has often been characterized as the epitome of this American special relationship with China, a resolute Uncle Sam preventing the one economic carve-up of the Middle Kingdom by ruthless European imperialists. So powerful was this American image of China that, by 1935, when the Assistant Secretary of State John Van Antwerp McMurray, himself a former U.S. minister to China in the late 1920s, came to write an assessment of the East Asian situation following Japan's invasion of Manchuria, he felt compelled to underline the residual hold of such attachments. America's ongoing sentimental attitudes toward China, he wrote, where McMurray's memorandum is highlighted in an insightful new analysis of George Kennan's approach to East Asia by former intelligence analyst Paul Heer. Heer shows too that John Paton Davies, himself born in China to missionary parents, and one of the State Department's so-called China hands in the 1930s and 1940s, later drew similar conclusions to McMurray in coming to terms with American policy towards China in the 1930s and 1940s. Davies believed that the missionary influence and U.S. guilt at not having intervened to protect China from Japanese invasion all fed a surcharged sentimental attachment in some policymakers in Washington. But the point here was that McMurray and Davies argued that such emotional currents unnecessarily inflated the importance of China in U.S. strategic thinking and planning. That was to change, of course, as it became clearer after the Second World War that Chiang Kai-shek's prospects for maintaining control in China were diminishing. Some American officials remained loath to come to terms with the prospect of a permanent communist power in China. In 1948, Kennan's policy planning staff judged that the Chinese communists, who they believed were enthralled to Moscow, would ultimately be on the receiving end of a nationalist backlash from the Chinese people for their subservience to the Kremlin. Mao's kowtowing to the Soviets would so provoke the powerful sentiments of nationalism and xenophobia against a future communist regime that its chances for long-term success would be drastically reduced. That sentiment found its ultimate form in a crucial State Department white paper which sought to challenge criticism of Washington's China policy, and which was released in August 1949 as the People's Liberation Army stood on the cusp of defeating the Chinese nationalist forces. That paper likewise judged that the Chinese people had been duped by Mao's communists into being mere puppets of the Kremlin. As Secretary of State Dean Acheson told President Harry Truman, the communist leaders had forsworn their Chinese heritage and publicly announced their subservience to a foreign power. What he was saying was that Chinese communism was not a genuinely Chinese movement. These Chinese puppets of Russia had tricked the Chinese people. Nationalism and communism in this view were incompatible. It was a tragic misreading of the politics on the ground, one repeated time and again during America's Cold War in Asia. Ultimately, Acheson believed the profound civilization and the democratic individualism of China will reassert themselves and she will throw off the foreign yoke. Moreover, he added that the United States should encourage all developments in China which now and in the future work towards this end, and of course, that end was to be the Chinese acceptance of democracy and liberty, America's national myth, far from being some kind of superficial or gauzy gloss. The ideals driving this policy had real effects. For a quarter of a century after the coming to power of the communists in China, America paid a high economic price for being true to what its national ideals dictated. Washington refused to recognize the regime, treating the People's Republic as a pariah nation and banning Americans from any contact or connection with the country, including economic ties such as trade and investment. But many of its allies, including Australia, would not agree to such extreme self-denying measures and continued to trade profitably with Beijing. This inability to face up to the costs of sticking by these ideals is in some ways understandable given the American experience in the wake of the Second World War. At that time, the United States' economic, military and cultural prowess reinforced its sense of ideological and therefore moral superiority. America had taken on a recognized and indeed necessary role of world leadership. It proclaimed itself to be the hope of all peoples in a troubled world. And it is of course the case that, Vietnam and the invasion of Iraq aside, the U.S.-led international order has ushered in a period of relative peace and prosperity over the past 70 years. Identifying and acknowledging moments where the United States has suffered strategic failure, however, is a more difficult proposition. Indeed, because of the innate power of the American national myth as an ideological force shaping U.S. foreign policy, its failures can only be ever approached from something of an oblique angle. Thus, if only the Chinese nationalists had not disregarded the advice of George Marshall and embarked on such an ambitious military campaign, or if only American aid had been better managed by Chiang's forces, China might not have been lost. In South Vietnam, America might very well have triumphed if only the right local leader could have been found to install the kind of democracy the Americans envisaged taking root there. Or if only the generals had been given sufficient numbers of troops and not been thwarted by meek presidents back in Washington. Likewise, in Iraq, the United States may well have been able to establish a flourishing democratic haven in Baghdad if only the planning for the post-conflict phase had been more thorough. China's rise, then, presents this American national mythology with an altogether different challenge. What does it mean for the deeply ingrained habits and culture of American primacy? It is hard to see a U.S. president or national security advisor developing a strategy to accommodate Chinese power. In part, this is because it will be very difficult for Americans to relinquish their sense of having been bequeathed a special providence in world affairs. They simply cannot conceive of themselves as a normal nation. Witness, for example, the call to arms from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who in a recent address to the U.S. diplomatic corps pledged to restore his department's swagger, a stance he said came from both confidence in America's essential rightness and an aggressiveness born of the righteous knowledge that our cause is just, special and built upon America's core principles. Again, it is worth stressing that this is no rhetorical fanfare. Pompeo means what he says. Speaking to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in late July, he referred to growing moves in allied countries to prevent interference in their internal affairs by the Chinese government, extolling the moves that the United States has taken in this regard via the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act. Pompeo remarked that, "We are beginning to strike that comprehensive response versus China that I think will ultimately do what has historically happened, allow America to prevail." And yet Middle America's rejection of the foreign policy establishment at the last presidential election was in part due to feelings of betrayal at being sold down the proverbial policy river over preceding decades by precisely the kinds of ambitious idealism that Pompeo is invoking. Indeed, many Americans who themselves formed the military backbone of the Cold War struggle have withdrawn their consent for this kind of foreign policy. And they have expressed a certain frustration with the grand promises of the Washington elites that they were witnessing the end of history, with the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. that China would eventually become democratic, or that Afghanistan and Iraq would become beacons of Jeffersonian liberty in the Middle East. Writing elsewhere, Ely Ratner observes that despite the contest between the United States and China for the heart and soul of this century, Washington and the American people have yet to grapple with this reality in any meaningful way. A critical but to date sadly neglected part of that process must assuredly involve taking a good, hard look at how the myths of American nationalism have influenced the course of U.S.-China policy since 1949.